My name is Josh Cowen, and I'm a professor of education policy at Michigan State University, and for the next few months, a senior fellow at the Education Law Center.
Well, thank you for joining us. And today we're going to be talking about your brand new book, The Privateers, How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers.
Yeah.
So I would love for you to begin by telling us what brought you to this topic and what brought you to this book.
Great. Yeah. So as I say in the book, so I started working as a young researcher 20 years ago at this point, more than 20 years ago, as a young graduate student on very large teams evaluating voucher systems in the early days of those programs, or earlier than today anyway, and built up part of my professional research career as a professor. I used to be at the University of Kentucky in Kentucky, and now I'm in Michigan. But I worked on a lot of different projects. I'm a policy analyst by training. And so my job has been for the longest time to ask what works in public policy, for whom, and for why. Um, and, you know, as I write about in the book, the evidence on vouchers was mixed for a while, and until about a decade ago. And about a decade ago, we started to see, as vouchers became larger and more recent, we started to see some of the largest academic declines for kids who switched from public to private school using a voucher. We saw some of the largest declines we've ever seen on any question in the research literature. And by about 2020 or so, I had sort of moved out of the voucher evaluation game. I had moved on to other topics. I was working a lot in my home state. And many of us in that professional evaluation policy analysis community had started to also move on. So, well, these were horrific. They're going to they're going to become extinct. And in fact, the opposites happened. And really, over the last couple of years, these things have bounced back with a vengeance. And so, as someone who's at a place in my career where I'm looking back at all this time and reflecting even to some extent of my role in some of the early days of these voucher systems, I started to ask why, and I realized that the answer was right in front of my face, and in fact part of the earlier days that I write about, and the answer is that despite some of these horrific academic declines that vouchers have caused for kids who use them, billionaires who've been pushing these schemes all along since at least 1990 have really turned toward Christian nationalism as the motivating force for these things. And it's why you and I are talking about book vouchers today. And there's also conversations about book bans and anti-LGBTQ legislation and rollbacks to reproductive rights and all these other culture war issues. They're all part of the same sort of motivation for this type of scheme, and vouchers is one important part of that.
Yeah, and I really appreciate how you tied even the origin of vouchers to this ideological scheme and some of the things that were happening in parallel to what was going on. But we'll get to that in a minute. I'd like you to begin by just defining for us what a voucher is and what it does and what its purpose is.
So a voucher is any type of there's a class of policy schemes that divert taxpayer funding, public funding, into private school tuition subsidies. The taxpayer dollars paying for private tuition. There's a number of different sort of technical policy details that kind of fit under that big umbrella, but what we need to know for today is a voucher is something that takes public dollars and spends it on private school tuition.
Yeah, and in the book you talk a lot about how vouchers came to be.
Yeah.
And how they kind of started in this Milton Friedman idea of free market capitalism and how it was developed by billionaires, which is the subtitle of the book. So could you walk us through some of the early characters who funded vouchers and kind of what their purpose was in their interest in this?
Well, as you say, and as I say in the book, and others have written at greater length than I have, that the original voucher idea did come from this conservative economist Milton Friedman writing in 1955, just months after Brown v. Board. And Friedman had started developing this idea before Brown, but certainly became aware as Brown was making its way through the courts that his scheme might be used to avert the implications of this mandatory desegregation order, and felt okay with this. At least he did in public writing. And we don't know what was in his heart and mind, but we know what he said in print. And the idea was parents should be able to move to whatever school they want, public, private, use these voucher schemes, and they should be able to do it for whatever reason they deem best, if including whether that amounts to deliberate efforts to avoid racial integration. But it really wasn't until 1990 when the first modern voucher system sort of got implemented at a pilot basis in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, followed very soon by near you all in Cleveland. And Milwaukee and Cleveland kind of developed in parallel to each other until roughly 2002, when the Supreme Court, using the Cleveland case, did rule that vouchers were constitutional within some narrow guidelines. The important thing to understand about all of this was, from the beginning, a number of right-wing foundations, I name a few in the book, that were active in both Milwaukee and in Cleveland, notably the Lindy and Harry Bradley Foundation, but also groups associated with the DeVos family and others, were always backing these schemes. And, one thing I don't get into in the book is any allegations that these were necessarily illegal or profit oriented even. I mean, if you take these folks at their word, this is about really withering the wall between church and state, and they have the money to make the advocacy case, in some cases, in a pretty effective way up through the judiciary. But this is what this has always been about: is withering the wall between church and state, and using taxpayer funding to support religious education.
Yeah, and taxpayer funding for education is its own set of problems
Yes.
and topics.
Yes.
And we won't get into that, but do you think that the billionaires who started these organizations and kind of came up with these think tanks to promote and justify the voucher system did it for purely ideological withering the church and state, or do you think there was something of a anti-taxation or getting your hands on that money?
Yeah, so that's an important distinction. So, the two big players, billionaire players in the book, and still two of the three big billionaire players today in American politics on the voucher issue, are Betsy DeVos and Charles Koch. And Betsy DeVos is this well-known, billionaire heiress in my state. Charles Koch, a billionaire coming out of the oil and gas industry, very influential in right-wing politics. But DeVos is well known and said publicly that she, laments the placement of public schools as centers of community and really wants churches to fill that role. The Koch folks are not, the Charles Koch organizations are not particularly religious, at least not in any kind of ideological or policy oriented space, but they are very interested in rolling back what they see as government interference in business and in the economy. And, again, Koch's come out of the oil and gas industry. I don't get into, nor do I personally believe, that these folks are particularly profit oriented, at least not the big movers and shakers. They got billions of dollars invested in lots of other things. Schools are not, by and large, the most profit oriented. There are sort of smaller scale on the make vendors that do come up behind these programs and kind of clean up after the wreckage of the school system's been put in place. But again, not really an area I touched so much on the book. The real issue here is just an ideological fervor, and whether it's the Christian nationalism of Betsy DeVos or the sort of education industry of Charles Koch, it's really this ideological fervor. And the last point I'll make on this is one really important through line to all of this that these folks will talk about publicly, really is this deep antipathy toward labor unions. I mean, that is a very important connecting piece between the DeVos type perspective and the Koch type perspective. Education remains one of the more heavily unionized sectors of the economy, and a lot of this comes down to just old-fashioned union bashing.
Yeah, and I know we had a very contentious school funding issue. They put a levy on the board, levy on the ballot during pandemic times. And one of the big things that the anti-levy people were pushing was that the school teachers had Cadillac benefits, as they called them. And it was this kind of like a way to paint the school union, the teachers union, as somehow profiting off of this levy. But it was actually because of vouchers in
Yeah.
Cleveland Heights, we have many religious schools
Yeah.
now benefit from these vouchers.
Yes.
That's a direct result of the Zellman versus Simmons Herris case. So could you walk us through, in a very kind of thumbnail way, what happened and why?
So what happened with Zellman, the 2002 Supreme Court case, was specifically focused on the Cleveland voucher system. And this was, again, really modeled on Milwaukee, but it started funding religious schools from the beginning. So unlike Milwaukee started with just secular schools, not religious schools, and then it expanded right around the same time the Cleveland voucher program went online and got religious schools from the start. In any event, these things entered a lot of the courts. The theory of the case, at least as written by the pro-voucher attorneys defending, but both the outside attorneys, and I talk a lot about those outside attorneys who are sort of right-wing funders. They're also involved in today's Ohio lawsuit on the voucher system. But the argument was that was so-called a so-called crisis in Cleveland, and the crisis in Cleveland they were referring to was the educational quality of the school system. And it was on that basis that they went to the Supreme Court and said, listen, we can use vouchers as an important but limited public policy tool to help some of those kids and improve on their academic quality is trapped in that crisis in Cleveland. And we can also do so without requiring those kids to, attend religious services and so on. And that's basically the argument that the court bought in a 5-4 decision, the same five Supreme Court justices who had earlier, blessed Bush versus Gore, conservative in nature from the beginning. But in a 5-4 decision, the court basically said, yes, Cleveland voucher program does not violate church-state walls as long as it doesn't compel kids to attend religious services, to attend religious education, and really kind of drew a line at the religious education piece. It was very different than the rulings that have been more recent, which really bless, no pun intended, but I suppose it's a good word for it, really bless public use of religious education too, not just religious institutions. The court stopped in the Cleveland case at saying you could use this money for religious education per se. Now the Supreme Court in 6-3 decisions more recently has said you can absolutely use public money for religious education.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the things that, you spend a lot of time on the book, and I think it's one of those questions that come up a lot, especially when people are arguing on the internet, who funds what and why? And there's this kind of gotcha, like, well, Soros funds it or the Kochs fund it.
Yeah.
What was going on with the think tanks and the people watching voucher development that is important about who funded it?
Well, I think there's two things to this, so it's an important question. So first of all, there's nothing inherent about a funding source that's problematic if there's a real line between the funding source and in this case, the research involved. If there's not a lot of kind of what we call industry funding, right? So the concern over industry funding is that industry has an ulterior motive, not necessarily make sure the product's effective, but only as effective as it needs to be to go on the open market. But it's only as problematic as there's a failure to disclose. And I will say, one of the things, the sources the book draws on is the disclosures from these organizations. So to their, I guess, credit, if you want to use that word, they're very clear. Yes, the Bradley Foundation funded this research. And yes, the Bradley Foundation's funding the lawsuit on the other side of this. I don't think those connections are made in a lot of other research before. And that's what part of what the book does is just say the same folks funding the research are the same folks funding the lawsuits. But I don't, I try to talk in the book about what it means for the research per se. And policy analysis, like any other social science or any other scientific research, is very technical. It's very complex. I don't get into the weeds of the complexities of that. But what's important for listeners and for readers to understand is that a lot of decisions get made in these processes that are defensible in one sense, but aren't necessarily the end story and not the only event. And one of those sets of decisions just involve just the carefulness of the work, how robust they are to alternative methods and approaches using the same data, and then how conclusive do you present those results? And so one of the critiques I make of that line of research is that a lot of preliminary stuff got dropped into the market, so to speak. A lot of really early stuff that ended up not passing the test of time. Other researchers coming in and saying, that doesn't quite show what you guys said it showed, which is very normal, by the way, in the academic community. The difference is that, sinking and poking and trying out different things usually happens in the development of research projects, not rushed out the door on time for a court case or on time for a legislator. So that's one thing I pick on in the book a little bit. And then the other thing is that as the negative evidence accumulated, instead of just letting that stand on its own and saying, guys, Houston, we've got a problem. Something's wrong with this idea, and it isn't just Louisiana, and it isn't just Indiana, and it isn't just Ohio. All these things are going on together, all these negative voucher results that I talked about at the beginning. It's sort of this effort to move the goalposts. It's away from, say, academic achievement. Well, test scores are only good to measure with public school outcomes. We don't need to measure vouchers with test scores. And instead sort of building up this kind of flood the zone or kind of package those negative results with other softer, less rigorous approaches and outcomes. One of those to speak about is parental satisfaction. So I think all of us agree that parents should be satisfied with their schools, and all of us should agree that to some extent parental satisfaction with their child's education is an important indicator of public policy. But it isn't, for the most part, something that public schools get judged on. It's test scores, it's graduation rates, it's much more concrete things. And so my point on this is not so much that parental satisfaction isn't necessarily a valid indicator of success of a particular program, but my point is that it's not what we use to judge public schools. And so if we're going to create this invasive, cannibalizing, destabilizing educational intervention known as school vouchers, we need to do it at least while we're comparing apples to apples on outcomes. What are the public schools doing, and how are the vouchers doing on the same measures, instead of moving these goalposts around? And so those are the criticisms that I have of this kind of industry-funded research. There are some studies that aren't particularly good and strong, and I mentioned one or two of those in the book. But from my perspective, the real problem here is that these goalpost shifts have really masked the totality and really the horrific size of the negative outcomes that have been associated with vouchers, including in Ohio.
Yeah. Sorry, I lost my microphone for a second. I would love, I think that's such an important point, because as vouchers move their goalposts, there's a constant re-entrenchment of what public schools have to do and what metrics they meet, and they never get any benefit of the doubt. It's always stringent, and this is happening in parallel universes where public schools are being held to more account, and then the vouchers
are being attacked constantly for what they do and teach and those outcomes too. So,
and the national, No Child Left Behind versus all that.
And one thing to point out is that the early voucher systems, including the ones that I joined as a young researcher, were perfectly, all the legislation was perfectly on board with holding them to the same standards. It wasn't until the results got horrible about 10 years ago that they started to make these side arguments that no, this isn't the right metric. We need to do something else for private schools and vouchers not for public schools. It's pretty recent, and it's directly tied to the awfulness of the results once they started to use those metrics and compare apples to apples.
I would love for you to talk about how those metrics actually play out. And what they found, because one of the things when I was researching this book, or to get to this book, was I was looking for voucher information online, and all of it is glowing, all of it is super successful, all of it seems to be there is nothing. There are no failures within the voucher system, but that's not research shows. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, and that's what I mean by flooding the zone. So it's just burying the negative results around much softer, fluffier indicators. And you've got the big drivers of this aren't necessarily the academic researchers involved in this. There are a handful of them, but to their credit, have occasionally released negative voucher results. But what's going on then is they do that, and then the Buckeye Institute or the Heritage Foundation, key player in today's politics, or the Buckeye Institute's sisters think tank in Arizona called the Goldwater Institute, or the Badger Institute in Wisconsin. All of these are right-wing think tanks funded generally by the same donors, part of something called the State Policy Network. And this information just gets distributed back and forth and back and forth. And it's really difficult for not just readers who are just coming to this topic, but for policymakers, for legislators, for journalists. Certainly one of the key audiences for this are journalists, trying to kind of get them to kind of cover this in a certain way. So, at the end of the day, this is an ideological perspective. And I have, I think it's wrong, but, there is at least an honest case for this, right? Where some people will come out there, the more highbrow folks, they don't even deny that the academic outcomes are horrific anymore. They just simply say school choice is what they call vouchers, to try to kind of collapse everything into one. They'll say school choice is an end, it's an outcome to itself. We don't need to ask any other questions. It's just as long as parents have those coupons to go around, that's enough. And even that, I have the important thing for folks to understand about vouchers, whether they're in Cleveland, whether they're in the rest of the state of Ohio, whether they're in Wisconsin or any other place, is that when it comes to vouchers, it's the school's choice. It's not school choice. And what I mean by that is the schools do the picking. Okay, again, in the early programs, there were instances of schools, if okay, here's some taxpayer dollars, but to get those taxpayer dollars, you have to admit anyone who you have space for. You have to submit to certain financial disclosures. Now that's none of those safeguards happen anymore. So what happens is the state gives these kids their coupon, their voucher, basically, and parents are left on their own to go around and knock on doors, trying to find the school that will take them. And in many cases, parents find that there's no room at the inn, there's no room at the school, the door's closed to them. And I think that's a really important limitation that we don't talk about enough, because they do put all these things on lots of great slogans, like parents have the right to choose. And the reality is, when it comes to vouchers, it's the schools that do the choosing.
I don't think that you could stress that enough. And one of the things that you talk about in the book is that these private institutions can also self-select out students who would be special needs,
Yes.
learning disability. And can you talk about how that has worked in the voucher system?
Yeah, so a good example is, go ahead. A good example of this is in Wisconsin, where the state has some pretty robust protections on the front end. Schools can't overtly discriminate. In some states they can do a little more, but in Wisconsin there's some protection, at least on the front end on the admission side, but there's none when it comes to the counseling out, the asking kids to leave, in some cases even expelling formally. We see roughly 25% or so of kids leaving voucher systems every year and going back to the public sector. And what that means is we don't know exactly why they're leaving, but we do know they tend to be lower income. We do know they tend to be lower scoring on the exams that we do have data on. And in some states like Wisconsin, our team found that they tend to be more likely to be students of color. So you put all those things together, and while you can't formally identify them as being expelled, you do see this troubling pattern of lower income kids, lower scoring kids, and in some cases kids of color, more likely to exit out and to go back to the public school. And then there's a state like Florida, which has substantial evidence there from investigative journalists, as well as in Indiana, where the new player in this sort of discriminatory game on the school admissions side for vouchers is LGBTQ. So do you have two moms? Do you have a non-binary parent? Are you yourself as a teenager identifying as LGBTQ? Those have been indicators for some more recent forms of discrimination. And in some cases these days, the schools will put these schools will put anti-LGBTQ language right on their website and say you have to sign what they call a sexual morality pledge to even attend here. So, we have to be really realistic about what's going on here and what kind of activity these tax dollars are being used for.
So, yeah, and I'd love to kind of close on two questions. And the first one is, how are vouchers now? We've talked about how the goalposts moved, but they've been really intertwined, as you were just saying,
Yep.
with cultural war issues.
Yeah.
And we talk about how those cultural war issues are affecting vouchers and vice versa.
I think they're the key driving force today, the energy behind the voucher push. I just think, as I say in the book, there's just too many of the same groups. I have a whole sub part of the second to last chapter on Moms for Liberty. I mean, in the Heritage Foundation, these groups that say Trump won in 2020 and are also saying that we're teaching too much woke in public schools. Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, uh, has signed the largest voucher system in the country as of this conversation. And within weeks of doing that, he was defending a public school curriculum that said that there was some benefit to slavery. Um, and not only did the curriculum say that, but DeSantis said it personally and then doubled down on it and said, well, there's some economic benefits to the enslaved people. Include they learned skills, important skills like blacksmithing, and I mean, just really kind of out there stuff. At the same time, signing this voucher bill. Another form, and I don't talk that much about this in the book, but I do mention it. 5 of the last states in the last calendar year to have passed voucher systems have also signed rollbacks to child labor protections. They've also, a number of states have also signed rollbacks to reproductive rights in the wake of Roe, in the wake of the Dobbs decision. So all of these things are kind of happening at the same time. And I think really driving this conversation and this energy, because it's certainly not the academics. I mean, anybody, if you sort of called up a random person in the education evaluation space anyway, the New York Times covered, and to get the New York Times to cover a research study, it's a bit of a stretch, but in 2017, the New York Times headline was dismal results, dismal voucher results surprise researchers as DeVos era begins. Like, this was really well-known stuff. The Trump years introduced really new or reignited new elements, really kind of unfortunate, nefarious elements in American life that are now, I think, sustaining the voucher push through a really tough period, at least on the research and the evidence.
So my concluding question, I'm sure you get a lot, are diagnostic and what to do next. And it just
Yeah.
seems like we're up against a shotgun blast of like chicken feed, of just so much coming at everyone at all the time. But there are these connective tissues and there are these connective through lines. So how do you get the focus and what do we do to combat vouchers in the context of all this other stuff that's going on?
The first thing that has to happen, I mean, I think explaining what vouchers do, warning about them, which is what I'm trying to do. But the other side is in a more positive approach. Listen, at the same time, the folks pushing vouchers are also saying that we're just throwing money at public schools with no benefit, which is completely not true. As the research evidence has come to really reject vouchers as a solution to inequality in American education, we have had now 2 decades of very strong, consistent evidence that funding public schools matters. It really matters. Ohio used to be a leader on this until the voucher system really expanded. It Funding public schools matters. And it sounds, sometimes I say that, and if I'm talking to a journalist or somebody, even in an education space who supports public schools, but really thinks it's curriculum or really thinks it's, teacher training or something, all those things matter, on the margins, but they start with renewing commitments to funding public schools in the first place, because everything costs money. You get what you pay for. Where your treasure is, there your heart is also, to use a phrase from the Gospel of Matthew. Like, these things all go together. And then what are you spending that money on? Well, I talk about in the book, there's other kind of low-hanging fruit, just things that we know works for kids and families. Early childcare provisions, universal school meals, it turns out, have a strong evidence base behind them. We know they're kind of being talked about in the election right now because of Governor Walz, but even before Governor Walz was named as the VP pick, universal meals would have been like on the top 5 list if you asked any credible researcher in the education space what matters. Turns out hungry kids don't learn as well. Hot and cold kids don't learn as well. So investing in new air conditioning and for the summer days or the early fall days, better heating systems in the winter. You're in Ohio or the Great Lakes, we get a lot of cold days. Those things really matter. more ventilation systems. If the pandemic taught us anything, it's that our public spaces need better ventilation. We know those things actually have downstream improvements in academic learning as well. So listen, all of these things start with commitment to reinvesting in public schools. And it may not sound like the most intellectual thing, but I assure you the research evidence is quite well behind them, and I also think it's the right thing to do.